Hello to everyone who's tuning in today to listen to Canadian Firefighters Conversation with Terry Von Zuben, an autistic advocate with Autism Canada. My name is Brittany Schroeder, and I am the editor of Canadian Firefighter Magazine. Today, Terry and I are going to be talking about the Search and Rescue for Autism program, neurodiversity, and the needs of individuals on the autism spectrum. Thanks for joining me today, Terry.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the SARA program with you.
I'm really excited to hear all about it. And jumping right in, I'd love to first ask you about the needs of those who are on the spectrum and why they may differ from people who aren't on the spectrum.
Well, autistic people, myself included, perceive emergencies differently than their neurotypical counterparts or their friends and neighbors. So, what we want you to understand is that at an emergency, the stimulating environment that they're in can change how they perceive things. So, if you think of you're at a fire and there's a fire alarm activated in a multi-dwelling unit, that fire alarm can be so loud it can overwhelm the autistic person, and they may not be able to act or respond accordingly or appropriately in that emergency. At a car accident, all of the lights and sounds and noise from the equipment and the engines and the tools might again overwhelm an autistic person to make it difficult for them to respond. It could happen at a medical call or even at a emergency scene where police are involved and where someone's been either assaulted or there's been a violent occurrence, and the autistic person not being able to express their needs specifically to the first responders or follow instructions. So, because the person may be profoundly affected by the environment, they're unable to respond effectively to that emergency, and therefore first responders need to be aware of that so that they can assist the autistic person or that neurodivergent person to help them to cope with that situation.
You kind of mentioned it just there, speaking of first responders and how they might have to approach the situation a little differently. Do you want to go into a little more detail of how, for first responders, they need to alter how they deliver their services so that they are properly serving these members?
Great question. Well, firstly, the program doesn't change their protocols and operating procedures. Those are basically written in stone for most fire or first responders. So we want to tell you that we're not here to change your guidelines. We're not to change how you do things. What we want them to be aware is that the autistic people will have different needs, and to support those needs, they need to be aware of them. So going into an emergency, you need to be aware of what may be different about this person related to the emergency than it would be with a neurotypical person or a person that isn't autistic. How they do that is while doing their scene size up, which is their standard procedure, is to always examine the scene as they enter the emergency, whether they're doing a 360 around a building to check for other hazards related to the emergency, or they're walking around a car accident to check for other hazards and to make the area safe during the emergency, or at a medical call, they're triaging. The things that we want them to do is include a check to make sure that the person is stable enough for them to relate to and to work with. And if they're not, to be aware of that, because it could present additional hazards, not only to the autistic person, but also to the rescuer. So we want them to be aware that there may be additional problems related to that person's autism, or maybe it's a Down syndrome or a person with dementia. We want them to understand that they're entering a situation that there may be additional problems that they can't see on entering.
Now, you've briefly mentioned it, but I'd love to hear all of the details about the SARA program and, tell our listeners why it's so important to have this training.
Well, we'd like them to understand first off, autism is primarily a communication disorder. So the autistic person, when you arrive on scene, might not be able to respond to your instructions. So you need to be aware of that. If the person is not paying attention to you, they're looking off in a different direction, they're not responding to your orders or commands or whatever the emergency is related to, you need to be aware of that. And the other thing is that they might not be able to express their thoughts and feelings at the time related to being overwhelmed by the emergency. So going into that program, what we want first responders to understand is that many autistic people, including myself, will react differently in that emergency than they will in their daily social life. Um, That said, we also talk about what is autism. Again, it's a developmental disorder. It's how their brains develop over time from infant to adult. Autism isn't something that you outgrow. It's a developmental disorder that all autistic people will carry with them throughout their life. It might change in terms of their cognitive ability will change over their life, just as your cognitive ability changes over your life, but it changes in different ways. So we want people to be aware that the autistic people will have different needs at an emergency scene than they will in their home with their family. To be aware that as autistic people perceive different emergencies as they arrive on scene, to be aware of that, and then to understand that there are common issues or common behaviors related to autism that they would need to be aware of it. One of the primary issues that this program was developed around was bolting and wandering. That autistic people, many of us don't understand or don't recognize that when we're lost. So we'll go on, get distracted, go on to do something else and wander away from a place of safety, whether that's our home or the company of parents or caregivers, and wander off to because distraction to another area that may be unsafe, right? And the other thing is that an autistic person might not perceive that the people around them are actually engaged in a search for them. So they'll be interested in whatever it is, the water, the lake, the animals around them. They'll be looking at that rather than noticing that there's people wandering around calling their name
Right.
or and might not understand the reasoning for that. So you'll have a situation, as an example, would be the person would be lost and mobile. Many people, when they become lost, they'll stop and wait for someone to come and get them. That doesn't often happen with autistic people who become lost. So we want them to understand that there's specific behaviors that autistic people will engage in, not related to the emergency necessarily, but related to how they perceive the world around them. Other things that we want to talk to first responders about is to recognize behaviors like stimming. That's how an autistic person copes with the overwhelming situations around them. So if there's too much noise, too many people, too bright lights, or whatever, oftentimes autistic people will engage in repetitive movements or repetitive speech. And this might be something like a person sitting in a chair, rocking with their hands, rubbing their legs. We'll often see that in the back of a classroom. For those of you, or for those people who are listening that are public educators, might recognize some of those repetitive movements that children often have in classroom as possibly being autistic behavior. So they'll also do other things like repetitive special interest in things. Either it might be a game, or it might be specific toys, or other things that they use again to focus. We don't want to separate the autistic person from the things that they use to focus on and or to stim. And the reason for that is that might be it's the way that the autistic person engages their mind or focuses their attention. So if you take it away that stim aid or that tool that they use, they may be unable to understand or listen to or focus on your instructions, right? So realistically, if a person has either maybe they've got an iPad and they're playing a game on it, it's not that they're ignoring you; it's they're using that as a tool to focus so that they can accept instructions and continue to engage their mind, because otherwise they just begin to continually cycle through and are continue to be overwhelmed by their environment. That overwhelming is not specifically or a fright, a fear or fight or fright response, where a person can be so overwhelmed that they can't they need to get out of where they are. And that's where we have bolting happen, where they're fleeing from a situation, from a place that might be safe into a place that isn't. An example would be at a car accident where the person or passenger might, once they're extricated from the vehicle, would flee and run away from the scene. So you'll have somebody that might run over an embankment or into the water into another hazardous area from a place of relative safety. So we want firefighters or first responders to understand that there may be other hazards at the scene or secondary hazards that the autistic person will go to that will complicate the emergency more than it already is. We always talk about maintaining a safe scene at an emergency, whether it's you're staging for a fire or you're at a car accident. But realistically, they need to worry about the opportunity that the person may create other additional, what we refer to as secondary emergencies, based on them not understanding the hazards at the scene or around them. Right?
Right.
We talk to specifically about how to deal with these situations, and we talk about de-escalation. That's many police officers would be very familiar with that in terms of de-escalating a violent occurrence or somebody that's acting out. But we also talk about de-escalating in terms of lowering the overstimulation of the environment, and that might mean either moving the person, the person that would be involved in the accident or the people that escaped the fire to a quieter, safer location. And then to offer them specific tools that will help them to maintain their focus and to lower their anxiety level. And that might be providing them with tools like headphones that would cover their ears and lower the sound level. We know that in an emergency, the bright lights from a strobe from a fire alarm system would actually they desynchronize after about 5 minutes of operation. So the autistic person who might be sensitive to bright lights would have lights strobes flashing at them from almost every angle. So at that point, if we were to offer them dark glasses at an emergency scene, whether outside where all the trucks and lights are on or inside the building where the fire alarm system is happening, they would be able to use tools like that to help them again lessen their sensitivity to their environment, but also to focus and listen to or accept instructions from the first responders. So that again, we talk about the tools that they would need. The program talks about what happens when you're on scene and how to approach an autistic person that is overwhelmed. And that might be a situation where they're just simply stimming and they're maintaining their own focus, and at which point it would be very safe to approach them and offer aid and tell them what you're there for, identify yourself, and then offer whatever assistance they feel is appropriate at the emergency. There might be other times when the person is frightened, unresponsive, and combative. And at that point, we would say, you need to back away from the situation. You need to engage your other safety or other first responders, police and EMS people, to have a better way or appropriate way to support the person who might not be able to control their attention and their fear of the situation. So depending on the situation and the response from the autistic person, the first responder needs to ensure their own safety and act accordingly, not just for the safety of the autistic person, but also for the officer or first responder safety as well. So we talked a little bit about that, just to examine the needs not only of the autistic person, but the needs of the first responders, which are again also very important to us. We talked about 7 common behaviors related to autism and how, in terms of communication, movement, listening, understanding how the autistic person understands the emergency, and how for a first responder how to recognize those behaviors. So we break it down. They're based on the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that physicians use to diagnose autism. We don't go into specifically the pathology of autism, but we talk about how that would relate to a first responder meeting an autistic person at an emergency, and then how to recognize very specific behaviors that they would recognize that the person needs additional assistance. So that's important. We talk about, again, stim aids that the autistic person would carry with them. And you've probably seen people walking around the mall with, hearing protection on or dark glasses. Again, that helps them maintain their focus and to deal with the overwhelming situation that they might be in. But we also talk about having a tool or a kit, a sensory support kit on the apparatus that the first responders can respond with. So that might be staged with the RIT team at a house fire, where they would take that kit in with them. If we said we've got an adult autistic person who's barricaded themselves in the bathroom because they're overwhelmed by the fire alarm system or one of many things that may be going on during that emergency, that would help them to again, to de-escalate the emergency with that autistic person and bring them out safely. In the event that there's a structure fire, you can't turn off the alarm system, so you need to deal with that differently, right? Similarly, there's other devices in that kit that would help them, whether it's a specific tools or toys that they can use to focus on, tactile objects that would allow them to maintain their focus, or the idea of recommending them putting on a bunker coat over the person. That much like a weighted blanket, it would allow the person to maintain. Support the person by, it's more like a big hug, in terms of just think how you would feel if you were a bit anxious and afraid, and you're standing on the you're sitting on the bumper of the fire truck shaking. Having somebody put a weighted blanket on you, especially for an autistic person, might not work for all of us. Many autistic people respond differently, and there might be that the sensation of the weighted blanket might be too much for one, or for some autistic people, but certainly it will help others. So being aware of what tools you have that you brought with you on the truck will be essential for you to be able to assist the autistic people at an emergency. We're working with the Fire Marshal's Public Safety Council to provide kits to fire services, so that we're hoping that every first responder or first run vehicle apparatus will have a sensory support kit in it. The idea being that these are essential tools, much like a pork kit. When you're doing extrication, there's a minimum level of tools that you would take with you if you had to do an extra auto extrication. The same thing if you're doing a psychological emergency where you have people, and again, maybe it's not autism, maybe that there's another disorder that you're trying to support the individual. You would be able to use the tools in this kit to help support the autistic people during that emergency. So we strongly recommend the use of a sensory support kit in an emergency. And the last part of the program is to promote a community services day, or a sensory sensitive public safety day. And that would be like an open house at a fire hall, but you would invite all of the other community partners, so police, fire, EMS, and maybe if you have search and rescue groups in your community, then you would invite them in. Anyone that would be involved in a large emergency in your community, you would invite those people in, and then have a what we refer to as a sensory sensitive open house, where you wouldn't have the tones go off, for instance. You wouldn't activate your lights and sirens. There wouldn't be loud music played. You'd spread everything out a little bit more on the grounds of the fire station, and you'd have events going on that are a little bit more, I would say, low key, in terms of you could go from one thing to another and not be kind of channeled in or funneled through the fire hall, and have everything all collected in one very loud, continuous event. Spread things out, and hopefully quiet things down, so that anyone on the spectrum attending the event would feel at home, right? Because we want them to be there. We want them to be comfortable. A lot of autistic people, when they attend community events like this, they're only able to last about 10 or 15 minutes, and then they're overwhelmed, and there's no place to go, so they'd have to leave. Wherein if you had a sensory support room, maybe you take an office, and that's the quiet place to go to, and you let people know that as they come in, that you have that available to them, again, with maybe a couple of sensory support kits available. So if they are overwhelmed by the sounds and the going on at the event, they can put on a set of earphones or the dark glasses and the other things to help them calm down, and then they can re-engage with the first responders. It's a very important opportunity. You don't want to be introducing you as a career, the first responders, to an autistic person at an emergency. It's better to do that at the fire station, or maybe even at their home, but not in an emergency situation. So, because we need to build trust, right? The last thing you want to do is be working on trust levels during the emergency. So if they can do something specifically with the autistic community or the neurodiverse community in that group, or sorry, in that community, the whatever jurisdiction it is, it's very important to start there, and then to build. So what you do is you contact the local community support groups, the autism support groups in that community, whether if you have a treatment center or simply local autism support groups. You contact them to get their client list, and then or have them do the invitations, and you set up do all the logistics for the event. Most fire departments are really good at having an open house. Usually, we do it during Fire Prevention Week, and it's a lot of fun. I've done dozens of them, organized dozens of them, and I've attended hundreds. They're all very good, but I would like fire departments to be thinking about having something at each event that is sensory sensitive for the autistic and neurodiverse community. It might just be if you're having a regular event because you can't host 2 events in a year. That's certainly understandable, but maybe have a sensory support room, yeah, at the fire hall for anyone that come in. A lot of large community arenas and community events, they're doing that now. Rogers Center, for instance, just opened their first sensory support room. So anybody going to the baseball game, the Blue Jays, or a sports event at Rogers Center, if the autistic person becomes overwhelmed by the events, probably the last place I would want to be myself. So I would go to having that room available, even if I don't use it. Knowing it's there is a win for me. And the other thing would mention is a lot, or at least the question I had, one of the last presentations I did was service dogs. And then what's the deal with service dogs? Like, how do we care for them, and what do we do when we approach somebody that is autistic and has a service dog with them? And I could just say that the service dog, mine included, is they're a medical support. So we want to think of them as never separate the dog from the person. Many dogs are trained not only to alert the individual, so maybe it's to their anxiety, or maybe to help them focus and pay attention. I've had to get up and give a presentation to the 300 fire chiefs. As you see, I speak quickly. I'm a little bit disoriented sometimes in how I speak, although I am a subject expert. If you ask me a specific question, can answer it. But going through a long list of things, sometimes I speak quickly. I have a problem focusing sometimes. Without my dog, it would take me about 15 minutes to get up in front of the 300 fire chiefs and actually speak on a topic like autism. With Molly, my service dog, it's 2. So she actually helps me focus. So, but in terms of the emergency scene, if I could say, never separate a service dog from their partner, from the person. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So if the person is being transported to a hospital, the service dog goes with them. If they're being detained for the police to assist them, and then the service dog stays with them and then goes with the person, with the police. We don't ever separate a person from their service dog. If I could just, that's also very, very important. The dog is not a pet. It is a medical device, and the dog has been specifically trained to do specific things to support that person. And if you take the dog away from them, now you've removed their support system. So just if I could say, that's very important to me in terms of the last thing that should happen is my dog be taken away from me, because the dog may be the only thing that's keeping me together in terms of my ability to focus on the instructions of the first responders around me.
Incredible. I think that is such useful information. So thank you for sharing all of that. And the idea of that open house community day, that I agree that that's something that every community should be doing if they can, because then you get to meet someone outside of an emergency situation, like you said. That it's such a good idea. A question about the training. I assume it's done in person at a fire station.
Actually, we're doing it virtually. So
Okay.
it's the training is only 1 hour.
Cool.
It'll be very similar to the way we're talking now. I have a PowerPoint I'll bring up, and I speak to the topics on the PowerPoint. The information in the program has been vetted and researched by several police and fire departments. So what we're speaking to is peer reviewed. So the fire departments that are receiving the information can trust that it's appropriate and will work with their standing guidelines and protocols. So we're not trying to change how they're doing it. We're just trying to give them the appropriate information to use while they're doing it. Again, a 1 hour live presentation. So we're working on a video right now with a local community that a fire department might be able to order. It hasn't been done yet, but we're working on that now. But the idea is that I come online, I do a 1 hour presentation, and then the departments or the people participating in the program can ask me questions. So again, a fairly good format for us to learn. It works very well with volunteer fire departments. And volunteer community groups. So if it's a volunteer search and rescue or a volunteer organizations, normally they have training nights. So I can just be the guest speaker at a training night. I've done several in Ontario so far, and they've all worked out really well. Most of the departments hearing back from the platoon chiefs and the training officers, it was very well received in terms of like information we should have had a long time ago. So that's actually very helpful. And also in terms of it's useful information for the most part. Most of the fire people feel that this is part of their job, providing care for individuals, whether they're autistic, neurodiverse, or neurotypical people in their community. That their job is to provide care for these individuals during an emergency. So that giving them an understanding of how an autistic person may see the emergency provides them a reference point that they can use. The one thing I remind first responders at the beginning of the presentation is that there is no typical autistic person. What I talk about is maybe a amalgamation or a grouping of symptoms that are common to autism, but truly my autism is going to be different than somebody else's. So if there's an autistic person who may have different symptoms, depending on the environment. So someone who may be sensitive to loud noise or bright lights may have additional problems communicating if they have social issues as well. So or difficulty movement, either gross motor function or fine motor skills. The situation or the environment that they're in might make them worse. So not to think of me as the typical autistic person. If you know one autistic person, you truly only know one autistic person, but there are commonalities for autism, and it's those commonalities that the first responders or firefighters are going to need to be aware of and in order to work with the people they're supporting.
Of course. And I mean, now that you've told me that it's a virtual training, it makes it so much more accessible for anyone across Canada to get it. And that's incredible. That means everyone can get the training.
Yes, and that's our point. Really, if we can trying to provide as much training as possible. Over the last, I guess, year, we've been working under a grant from Enbridge Canada. So I'd like to big shout out to our sponsors at Enbridge. Okay, they've been doing an awful lot in terms of providing education materials for fire departments across Canada, as you've probably seen notices from the Fire Marshal's Public Safety Council and from Enbridge, that they've been doing a lot in terms of sponsoring fire departments to get the tools and equipment necessary for you to do your job. Enbridge also feels that this is also another key or an essential bit of information and a tool that they need while they're supporting their communities. So right now our calendar is open.
Terry, just in the last few minutes, is there anything else that you wanted to mention or share with any of the first responders who might be listening right now?
Yeah, just that when you see an autistic person who's having difficulty, the idea is that they're not there to give you a hard time. They're actually having a hard time. So if they're unresponsive or they're not able to focus and they're not listening to your instructions, you arrive on scene, you see a person sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth or rubbing or focusing on a thing, approach them in their line of sight, talk to them, tell them that you're there to support them, and if you owe them one thing, if you owe them anything, it's patience. So please, it's essential that you give them time, and during the emergency, time to process what you're telling them. Very important. If I'm going to leave them, if the first responders with anything, it's the idea that if you owe any neurodiverse person or someone with a cognitive disorder, anything, it's you owe them your patience. So please give them time to understand what you're saying and give them time to respond, and hopefully that will work towards a positive outcome. Right.
That's incredible. I think that's a perfect way to end our chat today. Terry, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking with me today and sharing with our listeners the importance of this training for first responders and how it won't only just benefit the first responders, but it will really benefit everyone in the community. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
To all those who tuned in, we hope you enjoyed our conversation, and remember to check out all things training this week exclusively on Canadian Firefighters website. Thanks and stay safe.